The ledger lay open on Dr. Elias Thorne's desk, its pages brittle and foxed with age, a testament to years of meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping. Outside his window, the Alabama sun beat down, a relentless orb of fire upon the dusty main street of Willow Creek. It was the year 1847, and the air hung thick and heavy, laden with the scent of blooming jasmine, the distant hum of cicadas, and the ever-present cloying sweetness of ripening cotton. But Thorne, a man whose world was usually confined to the tangible and the empirical, found himself lost in a pattern that defied easy explanation, a chilling anomaly that had begun to consume his every waking thought. 17 girls, all born with hair the color of a sunset blaze, a fiery, unmistakable red, all with skin so pale it seemed to drink the light, almost translucent against the deep, rich tones of their mothers. And not a single one of them, not one, had a known father. The first instance had been a curiosity, a genetic quirk, the second, a strange coincidence. But by the 17th, spread across 6 different plantations, the pattern had solidified into something far more sinister, a silent accusation etched into the very fabric of the community. Thorne, a physician trained to heal and to observe, was now entangled in a mystery that whispered of systemic cruelty, of power wielded without conscience, and of a collective silence so profound it was deafening. He saw the children. He saw their mothers. And he saw the unspoken truth that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. The question that gnawed at his soul, that kept him pacing his small office long after the town had settled into its uneasy slumber, was not how this was happening, but why an entire society would choose to look away. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Thorne and the unsettling secret that would define his final years in Willow Creek, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining us here at Liturgy of Fear. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of history, to these narratives that whisper uncomfortable truths from the past, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. The algorithms often overlook stories like these, stories that challenge our perceptions and force us to confront the darker aspects of human history. Your support is invaluable in ensuring we can continue to bring these hidden histories to light. Now, let us return to the stifling heat of that Alabama summer, to the quiet desperation of Willow Creek, and to the moment when Dr. Thorne first began to understand the true, horrifying scope of what he was witnessing. Willow Creek, established in the early 1820s, was less a town of grand aspirations and more a functional artery in the vast, beating heart of the Cotton Kingdom. Its main street, a perpetually dusty ribbon of packed earth, was flanked by buildings that prioritized utility over aesthetics, a general store, its wooden porch groaning under the weight of barrels and crates, a sturdy brick bank, symbol of the wealth flowing from the fields, a modest courthouse where justice, or at least its local interpretation, was dispensed, a clapboard church whose steeple was the tallest structure for miles, and the inevitable saloon, its raucous laughter and piano music spilling out into the humid evenings. Dr. Elias Thorne's office, a small, unassuming structure tucked between the dry goods store and the blacksmith, blended seamlessly into this landscape of practical necessity. Thorne had arrived in 1842, a young man in his late 20s, fresh from his medical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He'd envisioned a life of intellectual pursuit, perhaps even contributing to the burgeoning fields of medical science. Instead, the South had offered him a stark reality, a practice dominated by the brutal exigencies of plantation life. His days were a relentless cycle of treating sunstroke, fever, dysentery, and the myriad injuries inflicted by the unforgiving labor of cotton cultivation. He set broken bones, lanced boils, and, most frequently, attended to the births of children, both free and enslaved. The white families, the planters, and their kin, viewed him with a mixture of respect and condescension, preferring their own remedies for minor ailments and calling upon him only when death seemed imminent. The enslaved population, however, saw him as a necessary, if sometimes feared, presence, a man who could alleviate suffering even if he could not change their circumstances. He was a man of quiet habits, Thorne, with a lean frame that seemed perpetually stooped over his medical texts or his ledger. His spectacles, perched precariously on his aquiline nose, were often smudged, and his thinning brown hair was perpetually disheveled from nervous habit. A bachelor, his life was devoid of the domestic comforts that many of his peers enjoyed. His true companions were his books, his meticulous notes, and the ever-present, unspoken questions that simmered beneath his calm exterior. He was, above all, an observer, a man who believed in the power of data, of patterns, of the cold, hard facts that could be gleaned from careful documentation. It was this very dedication to observation that had led him down this unsettling path. The first entry that would later haunt him was made in the spring of 1844. He'd been summoned to the Beaumont plantation, one of the largest and most prosperous estates in the county, owned by the formidable Augustus Beaumont. The call had come in the dead of night, a frantic rider on a lathered horse, signaling a difficult birth. The mother, a young enslaved woman named Clara, couldn't have been more than 18. She'd been in labor for nearly a day, her cries muffled by the thick walls of the small, windowless cabin she shared with her family. Thorne had worked tirelessly, his brow beaded with sweat in the oppressive heat, guiding the birth with practiced hands. When the infant finally emerged, a tiny, squalling bundle, Thorne performed his routine examination. He checked for 10 fingers, 10 toes, listened to the strong beat of her tiny heart, and cleared her lungs. A healthy girl, by all accounts. But as he'd wiped away the vernix, his fingers brushed against a shock of hair. It was an unmistakable shade of copper, vibrant and fiery even in the flickering lamplight, and her skin, once cleaned, was remarkably pale, almost translucent, revealing the delicate network of veins beneath. He'd glanced at Clara, whose skin was the color of rich earth, and then at the other women in the cabin, their faces etched with concern, their complexions uniformly dark. Red hair, Thorne knew from his medical texts, was a rare genetic variation that could appear in any population. But this combination, the intense red, the extreme pallor, was striking. A beautiful girl, Clara, he'd said, his voice softer than usual as he wrapped the infant in a clean cloth and gently placed her in her mother's trembling arms. Strong and healthy. Clara had looked down at her daughter, her face a complex tapestry of exhaustion, relief, and something else Thorne couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or a deep, weary resignation. "Thank you, doctor," she'd whispered, her voice hoarse, her eyes never leaving the tiny face nestled against her breast. Thorne had lingered, as was his custom, ensuring both mother and child were stable. As he'd packed his instruments, the question, almost an afterthought, had slipped out. "The father, is he here on the plantation?" The air in the cabin had grown heavy, thick with unspoken tension. The other women, who had been murmuring softly, fell silent, their gazes dropping to the rough-hewn floorboards. Clara had simply shaken her head, her eyes still fixed on her daughter. "Don't know, sir," she'd murmured, her voice barely audible. "Don't rightly know." It was an answer Thorne had heard countless times. In the brutal calculus of slavery, the paternity of enslaved children was often deliberately obscured, especially when a white man was involved. To acknowledge such a union was to invite complications, to challenge the carefully constructed fictions of racial purity and ownership. The children, regardless of their parentage, were simply absorbed into the enslaved population, their mixed heritage an open secret that was never openly acknowledged. Thorne, accustomed to the unspoken rules of this society, accepted the answer without pressing further. He made a brief entry in his ledger, *female infant, healthy. Unusual coloring, *. It was a curiosity, nothing more. But then, 8 months later, another call had come. This time, from the Oak Haven plantation, a smaller, less prosperous estate. The mother, a woman named Bess, had gone into premature labor. Thorne arrived to find a desperate situation, and despite his best efforts, the infant, another girl, had been weak and sickly. She'd lived only 3 days. But in those 3 days, Thorne noted the same distinctive features: bright, fiery red hair and pale, almost translucent skin. He'd asked Bess the same question and received the same weary, resigned answer. "Don't know, sir." 2 red-haired girls, born months apart on different plantations to different mothers. It was unusual, certainly, but Thorne, ever the rationalist, had still sought a scientific explanation, perhaps a rare genetic trait, a distant common ancestor whose genes had resurfaced. He consulted his medical texts, searching for precedents, for explanations. But then there had been a third. And a fourth. And by the summer of 1847, when Thorne sat at his desk, the ledger opened before him, the number had climbed to 17. 17 girls, all with the same distinctive red hair and pale skin. 17 girls born to enslaved women across 6 different plantations. 17 girls whose fathers were unknown, or at least unacknowledged. The statistical improbability was staggering. Thorne had spent countless hours poring over his records, cross-referencing dates, locations, and the physical characteristics of the children. He'd ruled out environmental factors, genetic mutations within the enslaved population, as the mothers showed no such traits, and any other plausible scientific explanation. The only conclusion that remained, the only one that fit the undeniable evidence, was one that Thorne had initially resisted with every fiber of his being. These children all shared a father. A white father. A father with distinctive red hair who had access to multiple plantations and the power to ensure that his actions would never be questioned, never challenged, never even whispered about. The realization settled upon Thorne slowly, like a suffocating shroud. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a creeping dread, a cold certainty that seeped into his bones. He had uncovered a terrible truth, a systematic pattern of abuse that had been unfolding for years, right under the noses of an entire community. And now, the impossible question, what should he do about it? The town of Willow Creek, like so many others in the antebellum South, operated on a delicate yet brutally enforced social contract. It was a world built on rigid hierarchies, where power flowed downwards from white men of property and wealth. At the bottom of this pyramid were the enslaved, who possessed no legal rights, no voice, no protection. The law itself was a tool designed to maintain this structure, to protect the interests of the powerful and to crush any challenge to their authority. An enslaved woman who accused a white man of rape would not only be disbelieved, but would likely face severe punishment for daring to speak against a white man. The very concept of rape in such a context was legally meaningless. Enslaved people were property, and a man could not be accused of a crime for using his own property, or for trespassing on another man's property with that man's tacit permission. The children born of such unions were simply more property, more assets to be worked or sold as their owners saw fit. Their existence was a testament to the absolute power of the white men, a power that extended even to the bodies of enslaved women. Even if Thorne could somehow bring charges against the perpetrator, and he had no legal standing to do so, the case would be heard by a judge who was likely a friend or business associate of the accused, and decided by a jury of white men who had every incentive to protect one of their own. An accusation of this nature would be seen as a betrayal of racial solidarity, a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system. The consequences for the women involved would be dire. To draw attention to their children's paternity would be to mark them as troublemakers, as threats to the social order. They would be punished, sold away, separated from their children and families. The very act of trying to help them would likely make their situations worse. Thorne understood all of this. He was not a naive man. He had lived in the South long enough to understand how power worked, how the system protected itself with an iron fist cloaked in velvet. But understanding did not make the knowledge any easier to bear. It festered within him, a toxic brew of anger, frustration, and helplessness. He found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom, the sounds of the night, the chirping crickets, the distant baying of a hound, doing little to soothe his agitated mind. He imagined confronting the men directly, demanding an explanation, threatening to expose him. But to what end? The man would deny everything, and Thorne would be ruined, his practice destroyed, his reputation shattered. He imagined writing to authorities in Montgomery, laying out his evidence in careful detail. But he knew such a letter would be ignored, or worse, traced back to him with dire consequences. He even considered more drastic measures. He was a doctor, after all. He had access to medicines, to poisons. It would be easy enough to slip something into the man's drink at a social gathering, to make it look like a heart attack or a sudden illness. But Thorne was not a murderer. The thought of taking a life, even the life of a man he had come to despise, was abhorrent to him. And so, he did nothing. He continued his rounds, delivered babies, treated illnesses, and kept his terrible knowledge locked away in his heart, and in the coded entries of his ledger. But the weight of that knowledge was crushing him, slowly, inexorably. The question of who had become an obsession for Thorne. He began to pay attention to details he had previously overlooked. At church on Sundays, he would surreptitiously scan the congregation, noting the color of every man's hair. At social gatherings, he would listen intently to conversations, trying to discern who had business dealings with multiple plantations, who traveled frequently, who had the kind of access that would allow for such systematic abuse. The pool of suspects was surprisingly small. Willow Creek was not a large town, and the white population was even smaller. Most of the men were tied to specific plantations, rarely venturing beyond their own property lines except for trips to town or occasional social calls. But there were a few men whose work required them to move freely between plantations: the cotton broker who negotiated sales and arranged shipments, the itinerant preacher who held services at various plantation chapels, the traveling salesman who brought goods from Mobile and Montgomery, and the county sheriff who made his rounds, enforcing what passed for law in this corner of Alabama. Thorne began to observe these men more carefully. The preacher, Reverend Josiah Blackwell, was a thin, ascetic man with dark hair going gray at the temples. The salesman, a jovial fellow named Cornelius Briggs, was nearly bald, what little hair he had left being a mousy brown. The sheriff, Wade Hutchins, had black hair and a thick black beard. That left the cotton broker, Alastair Finch. Finch was a man of considerable presence, a force of nature in the quiet town of Willow Creek. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a booming voice that carried across a room and a laugh that seemed to shake the very rafters of the saloon. He was a fixture at every social gathering, every church service, every important meeting. He had built his business from nothing, arriving in Willow Creek in the late 1830s with little more than a sharp mind, an uncanny knack for numbers, and a talent for negotiation. Within a decade, he had become indispensable to the local economy, the men who could get the best prices for cotton, who had connections in Mobile and New Orleans, who could arrange credit when times were tight. He was a man of influence, a man of means, a man whose word carried weight. And Alastair Finch had hair the color of burnished copper, a vivid, unmistakable red that he wore like a crown, often swept back from his high forehead. The first time the connection occurred to Thorne, he had been standing in Finch's opulent office, discussing payment for medical services rendered to one of Finch's household servants. Finch had been seated behind his massive mahogany desk, the afternoon sun streaming through the tall window behind him, setting his hair ablaze with light. Thorne had been in the middle of a sentence, explaining a dosage, when the thought struck him with such force that he actually stumbled over his words, his voice trailing off into an embarrassed cough. The hair. The same shade. The exact same shade as the children. Finch had looked at him quizzically, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Are you quite well, doctor? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Thorne had recovered quickly, mumbling something about the oppressive heat, and had finished his business as quickly as possible. But as he walked back to his office, the image of Finch's fiery hair, illuminated by the sun, burned itself into his mind. Could it be? Could Alastair Finch, respected businessman, church elder, pillar of the community, be the father of 17 enslaved children? The more Thorne thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place with a horrifying precision. Finch's business required him to visit every major plantation in the county, often staying overnight when negotiations ran late or when social obligations dictated. He was a bachelor, living alone in a large, well-appointed house on the edge of town with only a small staff of enslaved servants. He was charming, persuasive, the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of any situation. And he was powerful, with connections that reached all the way to the state capital in Montgomery. If any man in Willow Creek could commit such acts with complete impunity, it would be Alastair Finch. But suspicion was not proof. Thorne was a man of science, trained to rely on evidence and observation, not speculation and conjecture. He needed to be certain. And so, he began to investigate as discreetly as possible, weaving his inquiries into his daily rounds, his conversations, his very observations of the world around him. He started by reviewing his ledger even more carefully, noting not just the dates of the births, but also the approximate dates of conception, working backward from the gestational period. Then, during his visits to the various plantations, he began to ask subtle, seemingly innocuous questions. Had Mr. Finch been by recently? When had he last visited? How long had he stayed? Had he dined with the family? Had he spent the night? The answers, pieced together over weeks and months, formed a damning pattern. In almost every case, Alastair Finch had visited the plantation in question approximately 9 months before the birth of a red-haired child. Sometimes his visits had been for business, negotiating cotton prices, arranging shipments. Sometimes they had been social, dinner with the plantation owner, a game of cards, a night of drinking and conversation in the parlor. But he had been there. Every single time. The evidence was circumstantial, yes, but it was overwhelming. Thorne felt a cold certainty settling in his chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe, a knot of dread that tightened with each new confirmation. He had uncovered a terrible truth, a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years, right under the noses of the entire community. And now, he faced an impossible question: what should he do about it? The answer, he knew, was fraught with peril, not just for himself, but for the very women and children he sought to protect. The weight of his knowledge began to press down on Thorne, suffocating him. He found himself increasingly withdrawn, his usual quiet demeanor deepening into a brooding silence. The vibrant Alabama landscape, once a source of quiet contemplation, now seemed to mock him with its beauty, a stark contrast to the ugliness he carried within. One sweltering afternoon, as he rode his buggy along a dusty track bordered by towering pines, the sun beating down relentlessly, Thorne found himself contemplating the sheer audacity of Finch. How could a man live with such a secret, such a trail of silent victims? Did he feel no guilt, no shame? Or had he, like so many others in this society, simply compartmentalized his actions, viewing the enslaved as property, their bodies and lives existing solely for his gratification and profit? He pulled the buggy to the side of the road, the horses stamping impatiently in the heat. He reached into his medical bag, not for an instrument, but for a small flask of whiskey he had begun to carry with increasing frequency. A long swallow burned its way down his throat, offering a fleeting moment of oblivion before the thoughts rushed back, more insistent than ever. He thought of Clara, the first mother, her face a mask of weary resignation. He thought of Bess, whose child had died after only 3 days, a tiny, red-haired ghost. He thought of the other mothers, their names now etched into his memory: Sarah, Eliza, Martha, Lucy. Each one a silent testament to Finch's depravity. Each one a victim of a system that offered no protection. Thorne knew he couldn't speak out without proof. And even with proof, the system would protect Finch. He was trapped, a silent witness to a crime that society refused to acknowledge. The injustice of it all was a bitter pill, one he swallowed daily. The autumn of 1848 brought with it the annual harvest celebration at the Beaumont plantation. It was a grand affair, a ritual of wealth and power, where Augustus Beaumont, the patriarch of the estate, invited the white families of the county to revel in the bounty of another successful cotton harvest. The air was filled with the aroma of roasted meats, sweet pies, and expensive tobacco. Music, provided by a small ensemble of enslaved musicians, drifted from the wide veranda of the plantation house, mingling with the laughter and animated chatter of the guests. Thorne had little taste for such gatherings, finding the forced conviviality and superficial pleasantries grating, but attendance was expected, a social obligation he couldn't easily avoid without drawing undue attention. He stood on the periphery of the festivities, a glass of lukewarm punch in his hand, trying to appear engaged, his gaze sweeping over the scene with his usual detached observation. Alastair Finch was there, of course, resplendent in a new suit of fine linen, his red hair gleaming like a beacon in the flickering light of the torches that had been strategically placed around the veranda. He was, as always, the center of attention, holding court with a group of planters, regaling them with some humorous anecdote about a recent trip to Mobile. His booming laugh echoed across the gathering, and the other men laughed along with him, slapping him on the back, raising their glasses in toast to his wit and prosperity. Thorne watched him with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. How did he do it? How did he move through the world with such ease, such confidence, knowing what he had done, what he continued to do? Did he feel no pang of conscience, no flicker of shame? Or had he truly convinced himself that his actions were justified, that enslaved women were fair game, that the children he fathered were simply an unfortunate yet ultimately inconsequential byproduct of his desires? As Thorne watched, a young enslaved girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, approached a group of men carrying a silver tray laden with fresh drinks. She was one of the house servants, dressed in a clean but simple cotton dress, her hair neatly tied back with a ribbon. And her hair was red. Bright, vivid, unmistakable red. Thorn recognized her immediately. She was Clara's daughter, the first of the red-haired children he had delivered. She had grown into a bright, curious child, and Thorn had seen her on several occasions during his visits to the Beaumont plantation. The girl offered the tray to the men, her eyes downcast, as she had been trained to do. The planters took their drinks without truly looking at her, their conversation barely pausing. But Finch paused. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition. A fleeting shadow of something unreadable. Thorn couldn't be sure. Then Finch smiled, a warm, almost paternal smile, and reached out to pat the girl gently on the head, his large hand ruffling her fiery red hair. "Thank you, child," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're doing a fine job." The girl bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried away, her small frame disappearing into the shadows. Finch turned back to his companions, the moment already forgotten, resuming his anecdote as if nothing had happened. But Thorn had seen it. That brief touch, that fleeting smile, it was a gesture of ownership, of casual acknowledgement. Finch knew. He knew the girl was his daughter, and he didn't care. Or rather, he cared so little that he could acknowledge her in public, in front of dozens of witnesses, secure in the knowledge that no one would say a word. The sheer brazenness of it, the absolute impunity, was breathtaking. The realization hit Thorn like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. It wasn't just that Finch was committing these acts. It was that he was doing so openly, brazenly, confident in his absolute immunity. The entire community knew, or at least suspected, and they were all complicit in the silence. The planters who employed Finch's services, the wives who smiled and nodded at social gatherings, the sheriff who enforced the law, the preacher who delivered sermons on morality. They all knew, and they all chose to look away. Their silence was a shield, protecting Finch, and by extension, the fragile edifice of their own society. Thorn felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He set down his glass of punch, the clinking sound barely audible above the din, and made his way to the edge of the veranda, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the celebration. He stood in the darkness beyond the torchlight, breathing deeply, trying to calm the frantic pounding of his heart. The sweet scent of jasmine now seemed cloying, sickly. "Dr. Thorn, are you unwell?" He turned, startled, to find Era, the elderly enslaved woman who served as a midwife on the Beaumont plantation, standing a few feet away. She had been watching him, her dark eyes, ancient and wise, filled with a quiet concern. Era was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her face a roadmap of lines etched by age and hardship, her hair a silver halo beneath her headscarf. She had assisted Thorn at dozens of births over the years, and he had come to respect her knowledge and skill. She knew more about childbirth than most trained physicians, her expertise born of decades of practical experience and an intuitive understanding of the human body. "I'm fine, Era," he said, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. "Just needed some air." Era nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "You've been troubled lately, Doctor," she said quietly, her voice a low, resonant murmur. "I seen it in your face. You carry in something heavy." Thorn hesitated. He had never spoken openly about his suspicions. Not to anyone. But Era was different. She was part of the enslaved community, privy to their secrets and their suffering, a silent guardian of their unspoken truths. If anyone would understand, it would be her. If anyone could offer a glimmer of insight, it was Era. "Era," he began slowly, choosing his words with immense care, "the children, the ones with red hair. You've helped deliver several of them, haven't you?" Era's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a subtle flicker of weariness, a deep-seated caution born of a lifetime of survival. "Yes, sir. I have." "Do you?" Thorn paused, struggling to articulate the unutterable. "Do you know who their father is?" For a long moment, Era said nothing. She looked past Thorn, toward the brightly lit veranda where the celebration continued, where Alistair Finch's booming laugh could still be heard above the music and conversation. The sounds of revelry seemed to mock their quiet, desperate exchange. "Some things, Doctor," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "are better left unspoken. For the sake of the mothers. For the sake of the children. Speaking the truth don't always set you free. Sometimes it just gets you sold down the river. Or worse." "But it's wrong," Thorne said, his voice tight with a raw, barely suppressed frustration. "What he's doing, it's wrong. Someone should." "Should what?" Era interrupted, her voice, though still quiet, now sharp with an edge of weary anger. "Should speak up. Should accuse a powerful white man. And what you think would happen then, Doctor? You think there'd be justice? You think those women and children would be protected?" She shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound resignation. "No, sir. All that would happen is suffering. More suffering. The mothers would be punished. The children would be sold away, scattered like dust in the wind. And Mr. Finch, he'd go right on with his life. Same as always. That's how this world works, Doctor. You know that as well as I do." Thorne felt the truth of her words like a knife in his chest, twisting deep. She was right. Of course she was right. The system was designed to protect men like Finch and to punish anyone who dared to challenge them. Speaking out would accomplish nothing except to cause more pain for those who were already suffering beyond measure. His idealism, his scientific belief in truth and justice, crumbled under the weight of her stark realism. "So we just do nothing?" he asked, his voice hollow, devoid of hope. "We just let it continue?" Era's expression softened slightly, a flicker of compassion in her ancient eyes. "We survive, Doctor. That's what we do. We protect our own as best we can. We love those children, red hair and all. And we raise them up strong. We teach them what we can. And we remember. We remember everything. Maybe someday things will be different. Maybe someday there'll be a reckoning. But that day ain't today, and it ain't going to be tomorrow, neither." She turned to go, then paused and looked back at him, her gaze piercing. "You a good man, Dr. Thorne. You got a kind heart. But kindness ain't always enough in this world. Sometimes the best thing you can do is bear witness. Remember what you seen. Write it down. Maybe someday, someone will want to know the truth. And then your words, they might mean something." And with that, she disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Thorne alone with his thoughts, his terrible, useless knowledge, and the suffocating realization that the silence was not just a choice, but a brutal necessity for survival. The years that followed were a slow, agonizing torture for Thorne. He continued his practice, continued his rounds, continued to deliver the red-haired children that appeared with disturbing regularity. By 1852, the number had grown to 23. 23 girls, scattered across the county, all bearing the unmistakable mark of their father. Each birth was a fresh wound, a new entry in his ledger, a further testament to his own impotence. He watched them grow, these children. Some were bright and spirited, full of life despite the circumstances of their birth, their fiery hair a defiant crown. Others were quiet and withdrawn, as if they sensed the weight of the secret they carried, the unspoken questions that hung in the air around them. All of them were treated differently, set apart by their unusual appearance. Some in the enslaved community embraced them, protecting them, as Era had said, weaving them into the intricate tapestry of their families. Others kept their distance, as if the children's very existence was a dangerous reminder of the power dynamics that governed their lives, a visible scar on the face of their community. Thorne also watched Alastair Finch, though he tried to be subtle about it, his observations becoming almost a morbid ritual. Finch continued to prosper, his business growing, his influence expanding. He had been elected to the town council, appointed as an elder in the church, his voice carrying significant weight in both secular and spiritual matters. He donated generously to local causes, funded the construction of a new schoolhouse, sponsored 4th of July celebrations with lavish fireworks displays. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen, a man of virtue and integrity, a pillar of the community. The hypocrisy of it all made Thorne physically ill, a constant knot of nausea in his stomach. He began to drink more than he should, seeking a fleeting solace in whiskey when the weight of his knowledge became too much to bear. His practice suffered. He became forgetful, distracted, prone to dark moods that alienated his few acquaintances. People began to whisper that Dr. Thorne was not quite right, that perhaps the strain of his work, the constant exposure to suffering and death, had affected his mind. He heard the whispers, but he no longer cared. What was a reputation, after all, in the face of such profound injustice? In the spring of 1854, a new red-haired girl was born on the McIntyre plantation. The mother, a young woman named Hannah, had a difficult labor, and Thorne was called in the middle of the night. He arrived to find Hannah in distress, the birth not progressing as it should, her strength ebbing away with each agonizing contraction. He worked for hours, using all his skill and knowledge, his hands slick with sweat and blood. But in the end, both mother and child died. The tiny infant, stillborn, had a shock of bright red hair. Thorne was devastated. He had lost patients before. It was an inevitable, brutal part of medicine, especially in such primitive conditions. But this death felt different. It felt like a judgment, a condemnation of his own inaction. Hannah had died bringing one of Finch's children into the world, and Thorne had done nothing to stop it, nothing to protect her. He had merely borne witness, and it felt utterly, horribly insufficient. He attended the burial, a simple, somber affair in the plantation slave cemetery. The other enslaved people gathered around the shallow grave, their voices low and mournful as they sang spirituals that spoke of sorrow and hope. Thorne stood at the edge of the group, his hat in his hands, tears streaming down his face, unashamed. The raw grief he felt was not just for Hannah and her child, but for all the silent victims, for the crushing weight of the system, and for his own profound helplessness. After the burial, a cold, hard resolve settled within him. He went directly to Finch's office. He didn't have a plan, didn't know what he was going to say. He just knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. The despair had reached its zenith, and in its place, a desperate, reckless courage had bloomed. He found Finch at his desk, reviewing ledgers, a quill pen scratching softly across the paper. Finch looked up as Thorne entered, a welcoming smile on his face, a practiced mask of geniality. "Dr. Thorne. What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the—" He paused, his smile faltering as he took in Thorne's disheveled appearance, the wildness in his eyes, the raw grief etched on his face. "Are you quite well, Doctor?" "Hannah died last night," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, yet carrying an immense weight. "On the McIntyre plantation. She and her child." Finch's expression shifted to one of practiced concern. "How tragic. I'm very sorry to hear that. Was there a complication?" "The child," Thorne continued, as if Finch hadn't spoken, his gaze fixed on Finch's fiery red hair, head red hair. "Just like all the others." The room went very quiet. The only sound was the distant clatter of a wagon on the street outside. Finch's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes, a subtle tightening around the mouth. The genial mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Doctor." Finch's voice was calm, almost dangerously so. "I think you do," Thorne said, his voice shaking now, not with fear, but with a righteous, long-suppressed anger. "I've been keeping records. 24 children in 10 years. All with red hair. All born to enslaved women on plantations you visit regularly. All with fathers who are conveniently unknown." Finch leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes narrowed. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, almost amused, a chilling display of control. "That's quite an accusation, Dr. Thorne. Based on what? The color of some children's hair? Genetics is a mysterious thing. Surely you, as a man of science, understand that. A rare trait, perhaps passed down through generations. You're seeing patterns where none exist, Doctor." "I understand," Thorne said, his voice rising, trembling with the force of his long-held fury, "that you've been raping enslaved women for a decade. I understand that you've fathered 24 children and taken no responsibility for them. I understand that Hannah died because of you, because of your depravity, your absolute disregard for human life. Finch's expression turned cold, utterly devoid of warmth or humanity. He stood slowly, deliberately, his considerable height and bulk suddenly menacing, casting a long shadow over Thorne. "Be very careful, Doctor," he said quietly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You're making serious allegations without a shred of proof. Allegations that could be considered slanderous, damaging to my reputation and my business. Do you understand the consequences of such slander in this community?" "I don't care about consequences," Thorne said, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. A part of him, the rational, self-preserving part, screamed in protest. "Someone needs to speak the truth." "The truth?" Finch laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held no mirth. "The truth is that you're a lonely, bitter man who's been drinking too much and letting his imagination run wild. The truth is that you have no proof of anything that would stand up in any court of law. The truth is that if you repeat these accusations to anyone else, I will ruin you. I'll have you run out of this county, a disgraced charlatan. I'll make sure you never practice medicine again, anywhere in this state. Do you understand me, Doctor?" Thorne stared at him, at the cold certainty in his eyes, at the absolute, unyielding power emanating from him. And in that moment, he felt his courage crumble, his desperate resolve dissolve into a bitter, impotent despair. Finch was right. He had no proof that would stand up in any court. He had suspicions, circumstantial evidence, a pattern that could be explained away as coincidence by anyone determined to do so. And Finch had power, connections, the full, unyielding weight of the social order behind him. Thorne was a single, insignificant man against an entire system. "Get out of my office," Finch said, his voice like ice, dismissing Thorne as if he were an annoying fly. "And if you value your livelihood, your reputation, or even your continued presence in this town, you'll forget this conversation ever happened. You'll forget everything you think you know." Thorne left, his legs shaking, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had confronted Finch, and he had lost. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. The silence, he realized, was not just a choice, but a weapon. The confrontation with Finch marked a profound turning point for Thorne. He withdrew further into himself, his practice dwindling as his reputation for instability grew. The whispers about poor Dr. Thorne became louder, more frequent. He spent his days in his office, poring over his ledger, adding new entries as more red-haired children were born, each one a fresh stab of pain. He had given up any hope of justice, any hope of stopping Finch. All he could do now was what Era had suggested: bear witness. Remember. Document. His ledger became his confessional, his silent scream against the injustice. His once neat office became cluttered, dusty. Books lay open, forgotten. The scent of stale tobacco and whiskey mingled with the faint, lingering smell of antiseptic. He rarely ventured out, preferring the company of his thoughts, however dark, to the polite, pitying glances of the townspeople. He was a ghost, haunting his own life, a man consumed by a truth too terrible to speak. In the summer of 1857, as the oppressive heat of July settled over Willow Creek, Thorne received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, perhaps 25 years old, appeared at his office door. She was well dressed in a simple but elegant traveling suit, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her eyes bright with an intelligent, unwavering gaze. She introduced herself as Miss Abigail Winters, a teacher from Boston who had come south to work with a missionary society dedicated to improving conditions for enslaved people. Thorne was immediately wary. Abolitionists were not welcome in Alabama, and anyone associated with them was viewed with deep suspicion, often with outright hostility. He had heard stories of such individuals being run out of town, sometimes violently. But Miss Winters was persistent. Her quiet determination was a force Thorne found difficult to resist. Eventually, he agreed to speak with her, ushering her into his dimly lit office. "I've been traveling through the South," she explained, her voice clear and calm as she sat opposite Thorne, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. "Documenting the conditions of slavery. Not for immediate publication, Doctor. I'm not foolish enough to think I could publish such things openly in this climate, but for the historical record. So that someday, when this terrible institution is finally abolished, people will know the truth of what happened here. The full, unvarnished truth. A noble goal, Thorne said dryly, his voice raspy from disuse. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey, offering none to his guest. And a dangerous one. Perhaps, Miss Winters acknowledged, her gaze steady. But necessary. I've heard rumors, Dr. Thorne, about unusual patterns in this county, children born with distinctive features. I was hoping you might be able to provide some insight. Your name was mentioned by a few of the midwives I spoke with, particularly an older woman named Era on the Beaumont plantation. She spoke highly of your kindness and your keen eye. Thorne felt his heart begin to race, a frantic flutter in his chest. How had she heard? Who had told her? Era, of course. He studied Miss Winters's face, trying to gauge her intentions, her sincerity. Was she truly seeking truth, or was she merely a provocateur, a danger to everyone involved? Why would you think I'd know anything about that? He asked, his voice guarded. Because you're the doctor who delivers most of these children, Miss Winters said simply, her directness disarming. And because I've been told you're a man of conscience, troubled by what you've witnessed. Era said you were a man who carried the truth like a heavy stone. For a long moment, Thorne said nothing. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the buzzing of a fly against the windowpane. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out his ledger. He opened it to the pages where he had meticulously documented the births, the dates, the plantations, the distinctive features of the children. The faded ink, the precise handwriting, were a stark contrast to the chaos and despair they represented. 27, he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking the number aloud might shatter the fragile peace of the room. 27 girls in 13 years. All with red hair and pale skin. All born to enslaved women. All with the same father, though his name is never spoken. Miss Winters leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages, her expression one of grim understanding. Do you know who the father is? Yes, Thorne said, the word a bitter taste in his mouth. But I can't prove it. Not in any way that matters here. And even if I could, it wouldn't matter. He's too powerful, too well-connected. The entire community protects him, either actively or through their silence. They are all complicit. Tell me his name, Miss Winters said, her voice firm, unwavering. Let me decide what can be done with the information. My society has connections, Doctor. We have ways of documenting these truths, even if we cannot act on them immediately. Thorne hesitated. To speak Finch's name aloud to someone outside the community felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. It felt like a betrayal of the very silence that had protected him, however imperfectly. But what did he have to lose? His practice was already failing. His reputation was already in tatters. And perhaps, just perhaps, Miss Winters, with her quiet strength and her distant connections, could do something with the information that he, a broken man in a broken system, could not. Perhaps his years of silent suffering, his meticulous documentation, might finally serve a purpose beyond his own despair. Alastair Finch, he said, the name a venomous hiss on his lips. The cotton broker. He has access to every plantation in the county. He's been doing this for over a decade, and no one will stop him. No one can. Miss Winters wrote the name carefully in a small notebook she had produced from her bag, her pen scratching softly. And the mothers? Have any of them spoken about this? Have they named him? They can't, Thorne said, shaking his head. To speak would be to invite punishment, to risk being sold away, separated from their other children. They protect themselves and their children through silence. It is their only defense. Miss Winters nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. I understand. Dr. Thorne, would you be willing to let me copy these records? I promise they'll be kept confidential, used only for historical documentation, for a future when such truths can be openly acknowledged. Thorne considered the request. His ledger was the only evidence he had, the only proof that he hadn't imagined the pattern, that he wasn't simply a madman seeing conspiracies where none existed. To hand it over, even to allow it to be copied, felt like relinquishing the last thing of value he possessed, the last tangible proof of his sanity. But what good was it doing him? He had kept these records for 13 years, and they had accomplished nothing but to deepen his despair. Perhaps in Miss Winters's hands, they might serve some purpose, might contribute to some future reckoning, a distant echo of justice. Perhaps Era's words, maybe someday someone will want to know the truth, were not entirely without hope. Yes, he said finally, his voice barely audible. You may copy them. Miss Winters spent the next several hours carefully transcribing Thorne's entries into her own notebook, her pen moving swiftly and precisely across the pages. The only sounds in the room were the rustle of paper, the scratch of her pen, and the distant, mournful cry of a whippoorwill. When she finished, she closed her notebook, her face grave. She thanked him profoundly, her eyes conveying a deep respect and understanding, and prepared to leave. Dr. Thorne, she said at the door, her voice soft but resolute, I want you to know that what you've done, keeping these records, bearing witness, it matters. Even if it doesn't feel like it now, even if justice seems impossible in this time, the truth has value. Someday, people will want to know what really happened here. And because of you, because of your courage to document, they'll be able to. After she left, Thorne sat alone in his office, the ledger still open on his desk, feeling strangely empty. He had finally told someone, finally shared the burden he had been carrying for so long, but he felt no relief, no sense of catharsis. If anything, he felt more hopeless than before, because he knew with a certainty that went bone deep that nothing would change. Finch would continue his predations. The red-haired children would continue to be born. And the community would continue its conspiracy of silence, its complicity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the depths of human depravity and the resilience of those who suffer in silence, the story takes another turn. A testament to the enduring power of truth, however long it takes to emerge from the shadows. Dr. Elias Thorne died in the winter of 1859, 2 years before the outbreak of the Civil War that would tear the nation apart and ultimately, irrevocably, end the institution of slavery. He died alone in his small house, his practice long since abandoned, his reputation in ruins, a forgotten man in a town that had chosen to forget him. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, a convenient diagnosis. But those who had known him suspected it was more a failure of the spirit, a slow surrender to despair, a heart broken by the weight of unspoken truths. His possessions were sold to pay his meager debts. His medical instruments, his books, his worn furniture, all went to auction, scattered to the winds. His ledger, that careful, meticulous record of 13 years of observation and documentation, was found among his papers. The executor of his estate, a local lawyer who had never much liked Thorne, glanced through it, saw only medical notations that meant nothing to him, and tossed it into a dusty box of miscellaneous papers to be stored in the courthouse attic, forgotten amidst forgotten files. Alastair Finch attended Thorne's funeral, as befitted a prominent citizen, paying respects to a fellow professional. He stood at the graveside, his red hair now liberally streaked with gray, his face a picture of solemn respect. He listened to the brief, perfunctory eulogy delivered by Reverend Blackwell. If he felt any guilt, any remorse, any acknowledgement of the role he had played in Thorne's decline, his face betrayed nothing. He was a man utterly devoid of conscience, a master of deception, his public persona an impenetrable shield. The red-haired children continued to be born, though less frequently as Finch aged, his vigor perhaps waning or his opportunities diminishing. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, there were 31 of them, scattered across the county, ranging in age from infancy to 17 years. Some had been sold away, disappearing into the vast, anonymous landscape of slavery, their fates unknown. Others remained on the plantations where they had been born, growing up in the shadow of their unacknowledged paternity, their fiery hair a constant, silent question. When the war came, it brought chaos and destruction to Alabama. Plantations were burned. Families were scattered. The entire social order that had sustained slavery collapsed in a maelstrom of fire and blood. In the tumultuous aftermath, during the difficult years of Reconstruction, many of the red-haired girls, now young women, gained their freedom. Some left Alabama, seeking new lives in the North or West, hoping to escape the ghosts of their past. Others remained, building lives in the only place they had ever known, their roots too deep to sever. A few of them eventually learned the truth about their father. The knowledge came in different ways: a whispered conversation from an aging midwife, a deathbed confession from a former house servant, a chance encounter with someone who had known the secret all along. Some were devastated by the revelation, the truth a bitter poison. Others had always suspected, had seen their own reflection in a mirror and wondered at the stark contrast between their features and those of their mothers, their siblings. None ever received any acknowledgement from Finch, any support, any recognition of their existence. They were simply the unacknowledged, inconvenient truths of a powerful man's life. Alastair Finch himself survived the war, though his business was ruined, his fortune decimated by the collapse of the cotton economy. He lived on for another decade, a diminished figure in a changed world, a relic of a bygone era. He died in 1875 at the age of 73, a seemingly peaceful end to a life of quiet depravity. His obituary in the local newspaper praised his contributions to the community, his business acumen, his charitable works, his unwavering commitment to the prosperity of Willow Creek. There was no mention of the children he had fathered, no acknowledgement of the lives he had damaged, no hint of the terrible secret that had defined his life, a secret he had carried to his grave with the same impunity with which he had lived. The ledger that Dr. Elias Thorne had kept so carefully remained in the courthouse attic for decades, forgotten and gathering dust, a silent witness to a forgotten history. It was finally discovered in 1923 during a renovation project. A young clerk, sorting through boxes of old, decaying papers, came across it and, intrigued by the careful handwriting and detailed medical notations, brought it to the attention of the county historian. The historian, a meticulous woman named Margaret Thornton, recognized the significance of what she was reading. She spent months researching, tracking down descendants of the people mentioned in the ledger, piecing together the story that Thorne had documented but never told. She wrote a paper about her findings, presenting it at a regional history conference in 1925. The paper caused a minor sensation in academic circles, a ripple of discomfort and fascination, but it was largely ignored by the general public. The descendants of the plantation families, now respectable citizens of the New South, were horrified by the allegations and worked to suppress the story, to bury it once more beneath layers of denial and convenient historical narratives. The paper was never published in a major journal, and Margaret Thornton's groundbreaking research was quietly shelved, deemed too controversial, too unsettling for the prevailing narrative of a romanticized past. But the truth, once uncovered, has a way of persisting, of finding cracks in the edifice of silence. Copies of Thornton's paper circulated among historians and researchers. The story of the red-haired children of Alabama became a footnote in academic studies of slavery, a dark example of the systematic abuse that had been endemic to the institution, a stark reminder of the human cost of absolute power. And somewhere, in archives and attics, in faded family Bibles and whispered oral histories, the descendants of those 31 red-haired girls preserved their own memories. They knew who they were, knew the truth of their ancestry, even if the wider world chose to forget or ignore it. They carried that knowledge forward, a burden and a testament, a reminder that some secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually come to light, even if it takes generations. Dr. Elias Thorne had spent the last years of his life in despair, convinced that his documentation had been meaningless, that the truth would die with him, unheard and unacknowledged. He never knew that his careful records would survive, that they would eventually contribute to a broader understanding of the horrors of slavery, of the insidious ways in which power corrupts and silence enables. He never knew that the act of bearing witness, of simply recording what he had observed, would matter. But it did matter. It does matter. Because history is not just the story of the powerful and the victorious. It's also the story of those who suffered in silence, whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, whose existence was denied or erased by those who found it inconvenient. The red-haired girls of Alabama were real. Their mothers were real. Their suffering was real. And though justice was denied them in their own time, the truth of their existence endures, a testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, a reminder of the terrible price of silence, and a challenge to those of us who inherit these stories to ensure that such injustices are never forgotten, never repeated, never allowed to hide in the shadows of history. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the hidden histories that surround us, please consider sharing it. These are not easy stories to tell or to hear, but they are necessary. They remind us of where we've been and challenge us to do better. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more journeys into the forgotten corners of American history. And remember, the past is never truly past. It lives on in the stories we tell, the truths we uncover, and the lessons we choose to learn.